Hey guys, the purpose of this video is to help someone who's new to the Fuji X system or who's new to photography in general find the focal length which is right for you. While I've shot with almost every Fuji X mount lens available on the market currently, there's just no way for me to go through all of those in one video. So for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to start very simply. I'm going to talk about Fuji's F2 line of lenses as a starting point in this discussion. Stay tuned till the end of the video where I will give you a recommendation of which lens to buy first. But before we do that, you'll need to decide which sort of photography you'll be doing and which focal length will best help you achieve it. But to help me answer these questions, Fuji Pro Lenses has kindly let me borrow a few lenses to help me fill in the gaps in the lenses that I don't currently own. Renting a lens before buying them can help you figure out if you're going to like a specific focal length, or more importantly, a specific lens before committing to purchase them. Fuji Pro Rentals provides Fuji X system lens rentals as well as bodies. But before we get into these lenses, first I want to talk to you a little bit about why I'd recommend primes over zooms. I taught high school photography for a while, and the question I got then is the question I still get here on the YouTube channel the most is, what lens should I buy first? And invariably when I got this question, with maybe one or two exceptions, I would recommend a prime lens before a zoom lens. So what is the difference between a prime lens and a zoom lens? Well, that's pretty simple. I'm assuming you already know what a zoom lens is, but with a prime lens, you don't have the ability to zoom the lens. You're stuck at a specific focal length. That means that if you want to make a subject bigger in the frame, you're going to have to walk towards them. We call that zooming with your feet. Now you may wonder, why is this guy recommending prime lenses over zoom lenses when zoom lenses probably give you a lot more flexibility? Well, it's true they give you more focal length flexibility. Prime lenses can be advantageous for several reasons, but there's one reason above all, most important reason why I recommend it to beginner photographers. Prime lenses force you to consider your relationship with your subject to a much greater degree than zoom lenses will. Forget about the increased image quality or the better low light performance that most primes will give you. Sure, those are great reasons why many people choose primes over zooms, but in my strong opinion, zoom lenses create lazy photographers. Yes, there are exceptions. For some types of photography, you really do need a nice flexible zoom. But if you're just learning composition or wanting to get better at it, nothing will help you improve quite so much as sticking with a specific focal length. Okay, so with that polarizing opinion out of the way, now let's talk about these lenses. Here are 5 Fuji lenses, any of which would be a great entry point into the Fuji X system. These lenses all have one thing in common. They all have an f2 maximum aperture. With the maximum aperture of f2, what Fuji's done here is they've balanced low light performance with very, very small size. So for instance, here with the 23 f2 lens, when compared to its bigger brother, the 23mm f1.4, there is a substantial difference in weight and size. It's amazing how much more glass is required just to give you one extra stop of light gathering capability. If you're new to the Fuji X system, it's probably going to be one or two of these lenses that you're going to purchase first. Over the last week, we took this set of lenses with us to a few different photo shoots to compare their differences and to help you see what you might expect to get with different focal lengths in different environments. So which lenses do we have here? Well, starting from my right, your left, and working our way to the wide end of the lenses, we have the 90mm, then we have the 50mm, the 35mm, the 23mm, and then the 18mm. Starting with the 90mm f2, this lens has a strong reputation among Fuji X photographers as a portrait lens of choice. Of all the focal lengths we'll be talking about today, this is the one that does the best job of isolating a subject. That means that only part of the photo is going to be in focus and sharp. Everything else will fall off into beautiful obscurity. The 90mm is sharp as a tack, having just the right amount of depth of field wide open at the f2 aperture to capture the most important part of the face, while at the same time isolating it from the background with some creamy, beautiful, out-of-focus bokeh. It makes this the headshot photographer's dream lens. The other thing you'll notice with this lens is its compression. This means that objects in the background look much larger than what your eye might be used to seeing them comparative to your subject. This lamppost, for instance, with your naked eye at the same distance to the subject would normally appear not so large. This can be something you can use to your advantage, if you'd like a landmark to take on more significance behind a subject, for instance. Of course, the downside of this lens is how restrictive it is. If you're out with your children and want to be able to capture some of the action, you'll need to be at a very long distance away from them to be able to capture any of the background at all. This is absolutely not the lens I would choose to sit on my camera all day for an excursion out with a family. And in a lifestyle shoot environment, or in a small studio where you're restricted by the room you're in, you may get stuck photographing faces and nothing else. For instance, in this shot, you're given no idea that this guy is actually in a barber shop and not a pool hall. There's just no ability to capture the context. Additionally, with all that focal length, it comes with a price. This lens dwarfs the others in both cost and in size. While it is an incredible lens, it's probably more of a specialty fashion or headshot portrait lens, or it can serve you well if you're on the sidelines photographing your children's games. But it's probably not the lens that I would recommend as a beginner's photographer's or an entry point in the Fuji X system as your first lens. Moving right down the line, we have the 50mm f2. While still solidly a portrait lens at the 75mm equivalent focal length, this lens brings a lot more flexibility into a portrait shoot. Notice that here we start to see a bit more of our background while still providing great out-of-focus backgrounds for subject separation. This is a focal length I'd be slightly more comfortable heading out to a family event with, realizing that for anything where I'm really close to family members, I'm going to have to still back up a bit to capture any of the environment. But the one thing I love about this lens is that even if I'm a beginner photographer, I don't have to be brilliant with composition to still be able to get pleasing photographs. Let's say that I goof and I stick something in the background I wouldn't normally love to see there. It's not as bad because of just how much blur this lens introduces in the background when I'm shooting at that f2 aperture. And in a portrait situation, photographing a couple for instance, that f2 aperture can keep me honest and help me to keep both faces fairly sharp. Whereas with a faster aperture lens with a full frame camera, the temptation of shooting wide open can often lead to some ruined couples portraits with beginner portrait photographers. Now, as we get into this next lens, I'm not even going to try to hide my personal bias. This 35mm f2 is what I consider to be the perfect all-rounder, and is the only f2 lens of all of these you see here that I still personally own. At the 50mm equivalent focal length, it's a great shoot-around lens for a family outing or even a professional shoot where you want to be able to get wide scenes with a lot of context, as well as still be able to capture great-looking portraits with good subject isolation. Another great aspect of the 50mm equivalent focal length is that they tend to be the most affordable focal length in general in most brands of camera manufacturers, and that is no exception here, where it is the cheapest of the lot. But make no mistake, this is not a cheap lens. Its image quality is still brilliant. But now as we start to get a little wider in these lenses, I want to talk to you again about compression, but more specifically the effects of compression on the face. Looking here at this headshot, note the shape of the head. The front of the face, the nose, the facial features, they're all a bit larger when juxtaposed against the fall-off areas, the hair, the ears, etc. As we start to get into wider lenses though, you'll notice this effect exacerbated. Facial features will appear larger, while the head in general will appear smaller. If we look back at the 90mm lens, on the other hand, you'll see that more of the head shape is shown. The shape of the head appears more square, and those fall-off areas like the ears get pushed forward. The head seems larger vis-a-vis the facial features. Many will claim this is more flattering on a well-balanced human face and will turn to longer focal lengths in beauty and fashion to enhance the beauty of the face. But I just don't agree. Most of the time I feel like those shots just make the face look unnaturally flat and large. When I look at this photo of my daughter, for instance, that is not how I see her in every day. I don't particularly enjoy the look. But here at the 35mm lens, at the 50mm equivalent focal length, I feel like this is how my eyes naturally see her, and to me this seems more pleasing. But guys, I recognize I'm the minority here. If you're planning on getting into headshot or fashion photography, your clients are probably going to be happier if you have a longer lens in your arsenal. At least that's what I've been told. Okay, so now we're starting to get into wide angle territory, and we're gonna start here with a 23mm f2, which has a 35mm full frame equivalent. This focal length is what many consider to be the ideal street photographer's focal length. At 35mm focal length, we start to see a lot more context, even in tight places. This allows us to introduce a lot more artistry and creativity into our compositions. In my estimation, 35mm lenses is where we start to see separation between snapshot and artistry. In the hands of a photographer who understands how to compose an image, 35mm can be brilliant. Since the depth of field is much wider even at f2, you can't hide poorly composed subjects behind blurry backgrounds. Everyone will clearly see your compositional errors and poor decision making, or, when done correctly, appreciate your ability to choose a solid figure-to-ground relationship. Which leads us to our final lens, the 18mm f2. At the full frame equivalent focal length of 27mm, it is decently wide without introducing a lot of distortion. Shooting this wide can be the perfect choice when you want to get the full environment in an enclosed location. Here you can see I'm backed up against the wall and yet still able to capture everything important happening here in the room. However, for the same reason that the 23mm f2 was a good entry point into wide-angle lenses, the 18mm lens at the 27mm focal length, I'm throwing all these numbers out there, but basically all you need to know is that it's a little bit wider, and actually that makes a pretty substantial difference. When you're that wide, there's a lot more stuff to deal with in the frame, a lot more things to compose, and for many people that can be overwhelming. For that reason, this certainly isn't the lens that I would recommend for beginner photographers. Better, in my opinion, to start slowly with the 35mm f2 or the 23mm f2 and take baby steps towards handling larger framings of scenes. There's also one other aspect of shooting wide that I should mention. When we talked about the 90mm lens, I mentioned its unique characteristic of making the background elements appear super large against the subject. Well, here at the 27mm equivalent focal length with that 18mm lens, we can see the opposite effect. Objects in the background are much, much smaller. This can be disappointing when traveling, where you may want to photograph your children or loved ones in front of some interesting monument, where it may appear diminutive and not at all what you thought it would be when you got back home on the computer. Okay, so there you have it, a quick summary of these different focal lengths. So which one should be your first purchase? Well, that's gonna depend. Can you afford one or can you afford two? If you can afford only one of these lenses, then the decision, it's pretty simple. And for you guys, I'm going to recommend either the 23mm or the 35mm. If you tend to enjoy taking more portraits and tighter shots, but still having some context to the scene around you, then you're probably going to enjoy the 35mm f2 a little bit more. However, if you plan on getting more active children who are up to a lot of activity, or pets, or you just want wider opportunity to catch more of the scene, you can still get good portraits, you're just gonna have to get closer. The 23mm f2 is probably going to be a better place to start. But if you can afford two lenses, well, this is where it starts to get a little more interesting because you can get a little bit more extreme. For instance, when we started into our semi-professional portrait photography business, we started with just two lenses and only two lenses. Almost exclusively, we shot with the 85mm and the 35mm focal lengths. The 85mm focal length allowed us to get really tight, beautiful headshots, beautiful portraits, even group and family shots if we backed way the heck up. And then we would reach for that 35mm lens when we needed to get wider shots, where we wanted a little bit more environmental portrait shots, or if we wanted group shots, that sort of thing. Those two focal lengths served us well for about 2 years. If that sounds like the place you'd like to start, then I'd suggest the 23mm f2 lens and the 50mm f2 lens. But if you can afford two lenses and you actually also want to do some sports, then maybe it would be better for you to get that 23mm f2 and the 90mm f2. That way you can still get some good environmental portrait stuff, still get that kind of walk around all-purpose lens in that 23mm, but then you can bust out that 90 when you're on that sideline, or get some really high quality portraits of your children. Well guys, that's it. That's my whole spiel on focal lengths. I really hope that you found something helpful there, and I wish you all the best in your photography endeavors. Remember, kindness before cameras. I'll talk to you again real soon.